Hasta es grabada. Bien, entonces voy a parar de presentar. ¿Te parece? Hola, Caro, tú puedes compartir, buenas tardes, tú puedes compartir la presentación para probar que está funcionando.
Hola, dale. ¿Ahí lo ves?
Sí, perfecto, bien.
Ahí.
Sí, pero pasa los slides rápidamente para que funcione todo.
Sí, sí, ahí creo que estaba funcionando. A ver, de nuevo. Sí, todo bien.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Roberto. Welcome.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much. Can you hear me well and see me well?
Yes, I can hear you.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Jose. So I think that we are all the presenters, so we can start. How do you prefer? Prefer in English or Spanish? It is not. How do you prefer the presentations?
Well, in my case, the slides are in English, but I can do it in Spanish as well. So whatever is better for the audience and the participants.
I would stick to English.
So we'll do it in English. Okay. So welcome to our session of Fiscal Policy 1. My name is Oscar Valencia, lead specialist at IDB. I will be the moderator of this session. So for today, we will have 4 wonderful papers. The first paper will be Carolina Ulloa will present Can Fiscal Rule Affect Income Inequality, an empirical investigation for Latin America. And then we will have the paper of Roberto Pirelli from the IMF about the fiscal reaction function and the role of fiscal rules. The third presentation, Jose Andres Oliva will present the paper, The Impact of COVID Crisis and its Emergency Response Programs on Poverty and Inequality in Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras. And the last presentation, I will present the paper, The New Fiscal Normal, Vaccination, Debt and Fiscal Adjustment in Emerging Economies. So Each presentation have 55 minutes and 5 minutes of questions. I will be, you notice 5 minutes before finishing each presentation to keep a stick on time. So we will start with the paper of Carolina Joao of Aix-Marseille. Thank you, Carolina. You can share your.
Yeah, thank you, Oscar, and thank you everyone for being here. So I am Carolina Ulloa. I'm a fourth-year PhD student at Aix-Marseille School of Economics, and today I'm going to present my job market paper, which is entitled "Can Fiscal Rules Affect Income Inequality? An Empirical Investigation for Latin America." So as the title suggests, this paper tries to answer the question of whether the implementation of fiscal rules has increased income inequality levels in some Latin American countries. And my starting point is that so far, the research of fiscal rules has mainly focused on the analysis of its effect on macroeconomic aggregates and its ability to achieve fiscal discipline. So this is more about the budgetary effect. Despite that, the fiscal rules remain a tool for fiscal policy and consequently have redistributive effects. And in this way, a better understanding of this dimension could shape a much broader set of policies and outcomes than the budgetary analysis itself, and it can also influence the decision to adopt them and how to improve their design. So this is also important because in Latin America, inequality is one is structural and is one of the sources of macroeconomic imbalances as well. So to be clear, fiscal rules are a long-lasting constraint on fiscal policy through numerical limits on budgetary aggregates. And this implies that budgetary boundaries are set for the fiscal policy and they cannot be changed frequently. So the main concern about fiscal rules is that the design and the implementation of them are silent about the composition of the adjustment needed to comply. This means that governments, when they are in place, they might face some pressure in order to meet the numerical targets. And this could lead to incentives to discretionary decisions that could end up hurting or having social non-desirable social outcomes. So this has led to the economic stigma that the implementation of fiscal rules can breed social costs derived from the unwanted side effects on investment, long-term growth, and inequality. So in this paper, I tried to study this link and to see if this economic stigma is warranted or not. So in this paper, I explored the link for 4 Latin American countries, which are Brazil, Chile, Colombia, and Mexico. And the main result of the paper is that I found a positive, although statistically insignificant effect for the implemented fiscal rules on income inequality in all the countries, suggesting a lack of causal impact. And this simply means that implementing fiscal rules in these countries has not necessarily affected the income inequality levels. And so the economic stigma is unwarranted. And this result holds when including changes in income inequality measures and alternative data sets. On the second part of the paper, I carry on a country-specific analysis of the economic and legal framework of the enforced rules for each country. And I showed that the consistency with the economic framework in force is essential and best explains the lack of social costs. So on the related literature, concerning the effects of fiscal rules on income inequality specifically, little has been investigated. We have one study for European countries carried on by Harwing and Strom in 2018, where they tried the hypothesis of whether precisely the fiscal rules breed inequality with a set of fiscal dummy variables. And they find that fiscal rules implemented for consecutive periods significantly affected inequality. So this means that they raise income inequality. And on the other side, we have another study for developing economies, where COMS and co-authors study the impact of fiscal rules on inequality with propensity score matching estimations. The results show that the countries that adopted fiscal rules experienced a significant decrease in inequality levels related to countries that did not. So from these studies, we observed that there is no consensus, and actually the effect can be derived from the type of country or the economies that we are studying. Now, more precisely on how fiscal rules can affect income inequality directly, in the paper of Combs and co-authors, they also highlight at least 3 mechanisms which this effect can transit. And the first one is by affecting the fiscal balance, in which fiscal rules are likely to influence government spending and revenue. So this is focused more on two other tools of the fiscal policy, which are taxes and transfers. A second mechanism is through fiscal consolidation programs, because they are associated with higher inequality when based on spending cuts. And in addition to this, there's this a study by Ardenas in 2020 in which they find that fiscal consolidation programs are associated with reductions in public investment. And when they include this link with fiscal rules, they find that they actually help to vanish this negative effect. And a third mechanism is by affecting fiscal policy cyclicality, government's borrowing cost, and policy credibility. This also depends on the Thai economy. And in this paper, I focus more on the second transmission mechanism, in which we understand the fiscal rules as constraining our fiscal policy, and they could lead to disincentives on discretionary decisions on cutting expenditure or on bias on public investment. So I carry on this study specifically for Latin America because we observed that it could depend also on the type of economies that we study. So in order to investigate the level of income inequality and the effect with the fiscal rules, we need to ask ourselves first, what would have been the level of income inequality in the absence of a fiscal rule? So for this purpose, I used the synthetic control method that was proposed by one of the keynotes of the conference today, which is Avery, and with Gardezabal. And they proposed the synthetic control method to address these contrafactual questions involving one trade unit and few control units. So the main idea of the method is that they advocate the use of data-driven procedures to construct suitable comparison groups. This because in practice, it is hard to find a single unexposed unit that approximates the most relevant characteristics of the unit exposed to the event of interest. So in the method, they claim that a combination of units often provides a better comparison for the unit that is exposed to the intervention than any single unit alone. So they do so by creating convex combination of countries. In this case would create a synthetic country that will allow us to study this contrafactual. Now, in this paper specifically, we observed that the synthetic country is meant to reproduce the level of income inequality that would have been observed in the absence of the fiscal rule. So in order to create the synthetic country, the method takes into account not only the similarities on the trends on income inequality, but as well on a set of covariates in which these countries are also similar to the treated one. So in the data overview, we have that the intervention, as I said, is the implementation of a fiscal rule, and information is from the IMF fiscal rules datasets, which is up to 2015. Now, the outcome variable is the level of income inequality that we want to observe. And in the first step, I measured it by the Gini index of the disposable net income from the standardized world income inequality database. And then for the control countries, which in the literature is called the donor pool, I started with 194 countries from the IMF World Economic Outlook from 2008. So from these countries, I needed to drop all of these that have implemented a fiscal rule at some point. And then I contrast with the availability on the Gini index. Now, as I mentioned, the set of predictors, ideally, the covariates that are also going to help to select the countries that construct the synthetic country have a stable relationship with the outcome variables. So I took from the literature some variables that are already shown to have a relationship with income inequality, but also it is important that they are not affected by the treatment. Now, I took this information from the broad European indicators, and I end up with a group of 23 countries with available data, and the period of study is from 1980 to 2015. Now, I run the synthetic control method for each country. So this is for Brazil, Chile, Colombia, and Mexico. But for the purpose of this presentation, I'm going to focus on the case of Chile. Now, the Chilean economy is highly influenced by mining. So this means that the copper and molybdenum prices and their cyclical changes strongly affect the country's fiscal revenues. In this way, Chile implemented in 2001 a structural balance rule that tries to fight procyclicality, and they set up a target on the cyclically adjusted balance of the government. Now, on the budgetary effect, the rule helps to economic sustainability, and it achieves its objective by protecting expenditure from the economic cycle. Now, my hypothesis on the distributional side is that because the rule limits the actual government spending to the cyclical adjustment revenue net of the cyclical adjustment balance, this last component does not distinguish between the current and capital government expenditure. So this will lead to a situation in which capital spending is not protected from the government's possible discretionary cuts, and this could lead to a likely detrimental effect on public investment and hence in a higher level of inequality. So this is completely related to the second transmission mechanism that I mentioned. Now, the donor pool is composed of these countries. So this would be Bangladesh, Barbados, China, up to Ukraine. And here I have the weights for each country. So if we focus on Chile, we have that the synthetic Chile is going to be a convex combination of Barbados, Egypt, Guatemala, Honduras, Malawi, and South Africa. So one thing that I want to highlight here is that it makes sense that South Africa, for instance, is taken into account in the construction of the synthetic Chile, or actually in all the countries, because South Africa have similar levels of the Gini index compared to these countries. And in this sense, all the other countries that are included from the synthetic Chile have some extent, to some extent, similarities. We have some Latin American countries as well here, but most of them have also implemented fiscal rules and have available data. Now, the synthetic control method looks like this. So these trajectories are the disposable net income Gini index from 1980 to 2015, both for Chile, which is the dark line, and for the synthetic Chile, that is the dashed line. The vertical dotted line is the treatment. So this is the implementation of the fiscal rule in 2001. And what we observe is that in the pre-treatment period, the method wants to minimize the difference between both curves. So this means that it tries to find a really good fit so we can trust the divergence in the post-treatment period. The method does this, minimize this difference with an optimization process, which is through the mean square prediction error, which henceforth I'm going to call the errors. And this could be also thought about as the adjustment of the model. Now, what we observe is that in the post-treatment period, without the fiscal rule, so the dashed line shows a higher level of income inequality. So this is why I claim that there is a positive effect. However, we need to understand and study further whether this divergence between both trajectories are driven or not by the implementation of the fiscal rule. Now, in the pre-treatment period, we can think that the fit is fair since the scale, if we observe, is mostly on 46 to 48 on the Gini index. And given the high levels of the Gini index for Latin American countries, the approximation of a pre-treatment trajectory in this way is fair, and we cannot claim that these two trajectories are very different. Now, in order to study whether this divergence is actually coming from the implementation of the rule, we can conduct some inference. This is still an open question, and I decided to go with the placebo tests. So this means that I'm going to take Chile, and I'm going to put it back to the donor pool group. I'm going to take Bangladesh, and I'm going to run again all the synthetic method for Bangladesh. I'm going to have information for the pre-treatment period and the post-treatment period, as well as the errors. I take back Bangladesh on the donor pool, and I take Barbados, I run again. So this means that for each country, I'm going to have information on these two differences, right? Now, if I plot this, these are the gaps on the Gini gaps in Chile and the placebo. So the gray lines are the other countries, and the black line is, the dark line is Chile. So what we want is that in the post-treatment period, after the intervention, Chile stands out relative to the other countries. We observe that it is not the case, that is one of the largest, but not the largest one. So if we put this into numbers, and we consider these errors. The first information here that we have is the errors in the pre-intervention period. So this means how good is the fit? And we observed that if we compare the one of Chile with the median of the donor pool, they are quite similar. And we can construct a rank in which we get all the ratios from the smallest to the largest. And what we observe is that Chile is ranking on 14. And we actually want it to be the smallest one, so a perfect fit. Now we want
Carolina,
to know.
sorry, that is almost finished. Your time, please.
Okay.
1 minute at least.
Okay. So I only want to focus here on the donor probability, in which we can obtain from studying whether if we assign the treatment random in the sample, we can get the same outcome. So we observed that this is too high relative to the common ones, and this effect holds for all of them. So yeah, to conclude here for Chile, I claim that the best shock that can affect the government cyclically adjusted stance can influence the current account balance. So the spending is not going to be protected from the discretionary cuts, but this could be explained from the public investment and the expenditure, which I claim that is consistent with the design and implementation of the rule. So they are not affected at the end on this side. And finally, while the governments implement the fiscal rules, not only in Chile, but in the other countries to reinforce the institutionality and increase credibility and effectiveness in the management of public finances, the findings of the paper show that they are not likely to result in increased levels of income inequality. And the consistency with the economic framework is essential and is what explains why this effect is not observed there. And that would be it. Thank you.
Thank you, Carolina. So we open the space for some questions.
Perhaps I have a quick question for Carolina. Carolina, at least in the case of Brazil, the introduction of fiscal rules kind of coincided with the strengthening of the social safety net. I mean, specifically with the creation of the Programa Bolsa Familia back in 2003. So, they kind of overlapped, and coincidentally, the Gini coefficient came down quite a lot during the first 7 or 8 years. After that, things started to deteriorate a little bit. I wonder whether, social programs can be actually explaining why you don't see this causality effect from fiscal rules implementation through higher income inequality in the cases that you have studied. Thank you.
Thanks for the question. Do I reply now or we?
Yes, if you can. Probably there is other question, but you can reply now.
Okay. So yeah, I think that the fiscal rules can be also introduced as part of maybe a final step of consolidation programs that could help to put in place this kind of social programs. But sometimes the contradiction is whether the fiscal rules ends up to constraining a lot, and they can end up affecting these social programs. One of the features of Brazil is very important because they do protect a lot the public spending in this way. So the framework does not allow the rule to constrain to a point that the discretionary cuts will affect them. So this is why in the same way as in Chile there was no effect, there is no effect in Brazil either.
So I have a question, Carolina. It seems here that the composition of the fiscal adjustment matters for reduction. If you want to understand better the channel transmission, why the fiscal rule is affecting income inequality, it's a sort of endogeneity problem there. But in the examples, in the analysis that you chose, for example, for the case of Chile and Brazil, it seems that the adjustments through a government expenditure will be higher impact on reducing income inequality instead of through taxes, right? So it's general for the rest of the sample that you're considering, or it's more like depending on the country?
So your question is about the composition of the
Yes, or the adjustment to complete the fiscal rule.
Okay, so this is exactly the point where when they try to adjust, they could go either by cutting expenditure or maybe investment. And in the paper, in the part of each country, I try to analyze it, whether it comes from one way or the other. And mostly what I find is that they don't end up cutting or affecting investment because the rule is implemented in a framework that is compatible with the existence of these social programs. And it also happens that for most countries, the expenditure is very flexible. So they either want to cut, they don't manage at the end to do it through that channel.
Thank you. So we can move on to the second presentation. So here, so the second presentation is by Roberto Pirelli, Fiscal Reaction Function and the Role of Fiscal Rules. Thank you.
Yeah, I will share my screen then and then maximize it. Just 1 second. Okay, can you see it now?
Yes.
Yeah, let me do the full screen mode. I think that should be okay. Well, thank you so much for having me here. I know the time is a bit compressed, so I will try to present the slides over the next 15 minutes and left the 5 minutes for questions. You can interrupt me anytime that you want. First of all, this is a joint work with my colleagues Antonio Davi and Carlos Eduardo Gonçalves. The motivation of this paper on fiscal reaction functions and the role of fiscal rules is basically the escalation of public debt that we have seen during the pandemic. As you know, fiscal policies have played a critical role on saving lives and livelihoods over the last 2 years. In many countries, in fact, we have seen very, very large packages of fiscal and quasi-fiscal measures to support the economy and the population. This support was necessary and justifiable. However, it came with a cost, and the cost can be seen in the much higher levels of public debt that we have observed more recently. In fact, our initial estimates show that just in 2020, public debt around the world has increased by 18 percentage points, and it's close to 100% of GDP. But more concerning, our projections show that public debt almost everywhere will remain pretty high over the next several years, at least much higher than they used to be in the pre-pandemic years, right? So living with high debt is a very tough task, and countries will have to learn how to do it. And that's why we here are trying to study and to better understand how the fiscal reaction functions have worked over the past 3 or 4 decades in a relatively large number of countries, and to identify what were the main drivers. But most importantly, and perhaps very much related to the topic that Carolina introduced in the first session, we wonder how fiscal rules or different types of fiscal rules can play a role on the fiscal reaction function's ability to actually bring that to its historical average, right? In terms of literature, it's important to say that the literature is relatively extensive. However, it's mostly empirical. One of the most interesting papers is Bones, 1998 at JME. Bones basically studies the behavior of United States public debt and deficits over the entire century, over the entire 20th century, right? His most important contributions is a set of conditions under which debt can follow a mean reverting path. And this is important because this is one of the things that countries pay attention to when they try to establish a fiscal reaction function. Bones' approach was pretty much a linear After that, we have several works, some of them I mentioned here, that have expanded the bonds work both to other types of economies, meaning besides the US, but also to introduce some kind of nonlinear aspects. One very interesting nonlinear aspect is the so-called fiscal persistency or fiscal fatigue, right? I have worked in countries that have tried quite hardly to, to deliver high primary surpluses for many consecutive years, but it was simply impossible. After 2 or 3 years trying to do that, countries just fell into the social, let's say, needs and couldn't deliver that anymore. So the literature is well established, but we try to expand it here in 4 ways, right? First of all, we check under which circumstances the government interest payments become a critical driver of the fiscal reaction functions. And that question is quite interesting because more recently we have a paper by Larry Summers and Jason Furman from Harvard saying that given the very low level of neutral real interest rates, countries should no longer be looking at debt levels. They should basically pay attention to interest payments and try to live with higher debt levels as much as they can. We try to address, or at least to inspect this hypothesis here by checking both the role of average interest payments and also of marginal interest rates. The second contribution that we try to give is to re-examine the importance of fiscal persistency or fiscal fatigue in the shape of the fiscal reaction function. I think what's interesting here is that we are no longer looking only at a few advanced economies like the US and some rich European countries, but also to a wider class of emerging markets. And I think, that is quite informative, at least for the current stage of the global economy. The third contribution is that we try to unveil the role of unobserved heterogeneity. I mean, one attractive feature of fiscal reaction functions is that it usually is estimated in a very reduced form with very few variables, right? And the truth is, there are many variables that would have mattered for some countries and in some years that are not included because we are not able to collect the data on that. Therefore, the presence of unobserved heterogeneity is expected, and we try to unveil it using quantile regressions. That's also a novelty of our paper. Last, and perhaps most importantly for the policy work at the IMF, is to understand how fiscal rules have interacted with the country's, let's say, fiscal reaction functions, right? When I say interacted, I am trying to hint to the point that I'm not so much concerned about the level of a country's primary balance, but to how the country's primary balance reacts to different types of fiscal rules. Let's say rules basically that target debt levels versus rules that target expenditure levels, like Brazil has now, or rules that target budget balances, right? So these 4 points, we believe they add to the literature, and that's why we are pursuing this paper. In this next slide, I will very briefly just introduce you a reduced form fiscal reaction function. I think it's well known by everyone. On the left-hand side, you have the primary balance in percent of GDP. The subscripts I and T refer to time, to country and time, respectively. Our time horizon is about 50 years for advanced economies, slightly less for emerging markets. Our country sample is above 40 countries, for which we had good data on both the fiscal indicators, but also on fiscal rules. One of our projects is to expand that to low-income countries, but the quality of data is not as good as the ones that we have here. On the right-hand side, you have some typical controls like output gap and time fixed effects, which is the theta I, delta T, and country fixed effects, theta I. And you have 2 variables that are of interest. One is the interest payments, meaning that how much a country pays on interest over the debt it owns has a critical importance for the primary balance. And the other is the lagged debt level. Lagged because we want to avoid heterogeneity, and the debt level because many countries actually, they try to look at that variable as a main benchmark, right? We try to introduce all the controls as we go along, and you will see that in some cases they are relevant, in others they are not. In this presentation, I have basically 5 regression tables to show you. Therefore, I will try to move relatively quickly, but if you do have questions, please let me know, okay? I will start here with the most basic one, which is a fixed effects panel data regression of this reduced form fiscal reaction function. And here, I think what I want to highlight is the following. After controlling for output gap, these 2 variables of interest, namely the interest payments to GDP and the debt levels, become our focus. What we see here is that, as expected, interest payments to GDP are positive and statistically significant. So they do impact the primary balance. I mean, if I can read some numbers for you, I would say that in this column 1, for every 1 percentage point of primary balance on the left-hand side, all else equal, the interest to GDP ratio is responsible for 0.27 times whatever interest bill that country has, let's say 5 percentage points, right? So it's a pretty important contribution. However, and that motivates the sequence of our work, the debt levels are not important. And this is kind of striking because this is a very, very popular variable among fiscal economists. So these led us to basically, stand on giant shoulders and try to look at some kind of nonlinearity. I have a very, let's say, a very intimate relationship with fiscal fatigue because I've worked on countries that presented it. But it's also important to highlight that besides the typical fiscal fatigue that prevents countries from delivering high surpluses, for many years, there is also this more conceptual problem that between a budget announcement and the implementation of fiscal policies, there is a time lag, right? So fiscal policies are like a big boat moving surely but slowly. So there is both a theoretical point and an empirical point in introducing persistency here. The way we do it is just to introduce a lagged dependent variable on the right-hand side and keep the reduced form. Some people may say that this specification is subject to the nickel attenuation bias. We basically respond to this critique by saying that given that we have a panel with 50 years, this nickel attenuation bias gets diluted because it's more easy to find it in short panel data than in longer ones. Bottom line is that, as you can see here in this table, the persistence is strongly significant. I mean, coefficient between 0.6 and 0.7, which is also very high. But most importantly, the lagged debt level becomes statistically significant. And that explains a lot, and that kind of fits with our let's say, expectations. But this is just the beginning, right? We still have 2 or 3 more interesting results to show you. The next one is the unobserved heterogeneity. So as you know, and as I have said here, many variables maybe have left out. There are different ways of approaching this problem. The way that I like the most, and my co-authors supported it, is to actually apply quantile regressions on these panels. And the idea here is that once you apply quantile regressions, you kill 2 birds with the same stone. On one hand, you kind of don't require the same parametric assumptions that the typical panel data would require, let's say normal errors and so on. On the other hand, and perhaps visually easier to understand, you allow each coefficient to actually have different sizes over the distribution of primary balances, right? These quantile moving or quantile varying coefficients is quite telling because it says that, okay, for countries with lower primary balances, some variables are more important. For countries with higher primary balances, other variables are important. The results are shown here. Again, using this reduced form, fiscal reaction function, and you see that, for instance, persistence tends to be higher when countries have lower primary balances. Everything else constant, of course. The same happens with the output gap, but economically, I think 2 things are important. One is countries that tend to have larger primary balances, they tend to be more reactive to the interest bill. And this is showing the third row here. Conversely, countries that tend to display in this sample lower primary balances, they tend to pay more attention to the debt level, right? And that's very important because that provides a hint about what kind of fiscal rules such countries, should be trying to pursue. I shouldn't say the word should because I don't have the mandate for that. But anyway, it's just a suggestion. Okay, next one, motivated by the path-breaking work of Foreman and Summers, which by the way has not yet been a consensus here in Washington. We try to understand why interest rates matter and which ones matter the most. I mean, the average reflecting the entire duration of a country's debt portfolio, different maturities, different interest rates, or the marginal rate, which is basically the rate that the country will borrow next, right? The idea here is that if the rates continue to be historically low, the new borrowing will be quite cheap. Therefore, countries can carry debt at higher levels for many, many years. Well, when we estimate the same reduced form fiscal reaction function, we do see that some of the interest rates are statistically significant. But here the econometrician kind of pull his hair and says, oh, wait a minute. First of all, the first three columns are OLF. So the marginal rate is highly endogenous to other things in your equation. So you have to instrument that. We attended the request of the econometrician and we tried to instrument the marginal rate using some kind of instrument that can take, on one hand, time varying aspects, but on the other hand, some very country-specific aspects, right? And the instrument we found very quickly was an interaction between US rates that vary quite a lot, and that reflect the risk-free rates that countries face when they go to the markets. That is interacted with a capital controls index provided by Chin and Nito that's constantly updated. That is a more of a slow-moving variable. It's very country-specific, and it tries to capture the financial integration of this country, right? When we instrument that, we can see that in these three columns, the interest rates continue to be relatively significantly, but columns 4 and 6, they are not very robust, as you can see here from the statistics. So it seems to us that indeed marginal rates matter, but when you take into account the statistical weaknesses of our instrument, most likely the long rate may matter more than the short rate. Okay.
Sorry, Roberto, we are almost finished of time.
1 minute. Okay, I will go ahead. Now, final point, which is the most important, whether fiscal rules have any say on the fiscal reaction functions. Here, like Carolina, we used the IMF database on fiscal rules. The advantage relative to Carolina is that the same authors are actually updating the fiscal database right now, and hopefully over the next few months, we will be able to put out the database with the latest years. We basically look at 3 different types of rules: debt rules, expenditure rules, and balanced budget rules. And we see that they all matter, but they matter in different ways. What we see here, and I can comment on when we go to the questions, is the following. Countries that adopt debt rules, they tend to be a lot more reactive to debt levels. I mean, in this typical numerical example, if a country has a debt rule, everything else constant, its primary balance should be about 1.3 percentage points higher for every 100% of debt, 100% of GDP of debt, than if it does not, right? On the other hand, and I will finalize here, if a country has a balanced budget rules, the interest bill tends to be more important. And you can see that by summing this coefficient of 0.10 with this one of 0.15. So countries without the rule would have a reaction of 0.1. Countries with the rule, budget balance rule, would have a reaction of 0.25. We do that for several different types of rules. And we also check for how it varies across different quantiles. I can quickly skip this one. But the bottom line, because I don't want to take other people's time, is that we end up finding 3 or 4 different things that are quite important and they can render a further study, right? The first one is that persistence is indeed important. However, it varies. It varies a lot in this heterogeneous sample. The second is heterogeneity matters, I mean, especially the unobserved ones. The third is marginal interest rate, like Foreman and Summers, suggested, do matter, but with some caveat. Importantly, they may be quite endogenous even after we instrument them. And finally, fiscal rules do matter, but they have different, let's say they matter differently for different types of countries. High debt countries or countries that are trying to bring that down, they would be better off by adopting that rules, whereas countries that are not in such position have shown that once you have budget balance rules, you pay a lot more attention to interest payments. I will end here. I will open to questions, but I think the most important thing is to thank you for the opportunity and to say that this is work in progress and we have a lot to add. Thank you.
Thank you, Roberto. We open the space for some 1 to 2 questions.
Well, I find the work very interesting, and I wonder if time to time I've been estimate a reaction function for my country, and what I have seen is that the government vision is what is the government and what they want to do is very important, because if they want to spend a lot, is no matter the debt level. So maybe I don't know if that kind of things you can control with a variable, but in this case was a relevant variable.
You mean the willingness of the government to actually implement the fiscal rule?
Yes.
Yeah. I think this database that both Carolina and I are using has one weakness, which is it doesn't capture so well the efficacy of the fiscal rule. So some countries may have a fiscal rule in a de jure form, right? But in practice, that country keeps deviating from it. So we need a more qualitative variable to detect that. So that I think it's an important thing. The other important thing is that at crisis times, it's important that the countries may be able to use escape clauses to deal with emergencies, right? Without necessarily, abandoning their fiscal rules. And that's also something that over time we have seen in one country or another, but I think now during the COVID pandemic, it was a lot more common. These 2 things, I don't think they're captured here in these dummies, but we hope that they are more of exceptions than the rule. That in most cases, most countries tend to follow the rules they state they have, right?
I have a quick question about the fiscal reaction. In a recent paper, Andrea Previstero chose an exercise in which the fiscal reaction function is also controlled by the R minus G differential, the episodes of negative or positive. In your setup, can change the results or not? What are the implications of that?
Yeah, we know this paper by Andrea. He's in fact a colleague of us as well. We think it does, and in fact, we have actually a chart that alludes to the R minus G impact, right? The problem with R minus G is that more recently, I think the chart's no longer here, but more recently, what you have seen is that abnormally low R. So for whatever level of G, R used to be low. We have a map showing that for that kind of level of interest rates, even if you don't grow as much, your debt levels will convert back to the mean, or will follow some kind of mean reverting behavior. I think we try to capture that here indirectly, if I say, through these two variables, right? The interest payments to GDP and the marginal interest rates. The growth, we were partially capturing that in the output gap, although we're not showing that directly, but we think that the A minus G, can have a direct impact on it, but through different channels, it is being captured in our regression variables. That I would say that's the best answer. The supplement is that given the state of R, I don't know how much we can use R minus G to explain how countries have been reacting more recently. Okay.
Thank you, Robert. So let's move on to the third presentation. And so what we have in this presentation is the paper of Jose Andres Oliva, the impact of COVID crisis and its emergency response program on poverty and inequality in Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras. Please go ahead, Jose. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. I have the 15 minutes. I know that. May I share my screen?
Yes. So, Roberto,
yeah, I just have to get out of here. I pressed resume share. Let me see. Stop sharing.
Do you see the presentation?
Yes.
Okay. Well, this is an effort that we have done with a team. My colleague, Minor Cabrera, he's from Guatemala, Cristina Carrera from Mexico, Patricio Larraulet. They work for the Commitment to Equity Institute of the Tulane University, and Carolina de Franco and Andrés Oliva. I am Andrés Oliva. We work at FUSADES, la Fundación Salvadoreña para el Desarrollo Económico y Social del Salvador. And we want to do this because for us, the COVID-19 was a huge crisis, and we wonder to know what is the impact on poverty and inequality. And when we are doing this, we have the support for Southern Voice, to what we appreciate a lot. The presentation has 5 parts: a background, a key questions, the methodological approach, results, and conclusions. Well, all the countries, have a quarantine, and for the first step for doing deep for these questions, we need to know, well, how the quarantine impact the households' incomes and employment. When in March in 2012, the last year, 2020, was a decree for home quarantine. You can't go out of your home. You have to be there. Everybody in El Salvador. So this is the indicator of mobility for the people that using the mobiles, and you can see the sharp decline of the mobility in that March, that going throughout. So was like a 5 months that you have to be in your home. The schools was closing. There was a decree from the government to restriction of specific kinds of sectors, of economic sectors, and was a huge impact. The economy has a very shock, a large shock. This is Guatemala. You see the same, but you see a seasonal pattern, because in Guatemala was the weekends when you can you can't go out of your home. And so, and when the weekends going on, where is a decline of the mobility. Honduras has a more impact, the mobility going down more than the other countries. And how I say, this confinement of the citizens on companies lasts approximately 5 months of the 3 countries. And then we want to know, well, what's going on with the poverty, and we have a methodology to assess these things, and the governments start with several programs, what we call the safety nets or social protections, and we want to know if that social protection was successful or not. Well, the specific is the change in Gini, the change in the poverty. Well, the third part of the work was identified what we call the income at risk, because it's not true that all the income is going to be lost. It's a part of the income. And then we identified 2 key parameters that are what is the percentage of the population that is losing income, and the other part, what part of that income was lost, the percentage of that income. And this chart is more easy to see this thing. This is the composition of the income of the El Salvador. You have the centiles, and you know that color, blue color, is the direct transfer from the government to the households. This is the pension system. When you have a pension, you don't have a income risk in this situation because you are in your home, you have your pension, etc. This is the government salaries. If you are a public employee, you don't have a problem. You have your wage. This is the private transfer. This is the remittances, and this part we identify like safe income, because all these people is working in sectors that is not going to have the restriction for work. And this is the income at risk, this part, this green part. And then you have the thresholds, the poverty lines, the extreme poor, the moderate, the vulnerable, that we have in the 11 to $65 per day PPP, right? And then you have that line. We do it for Guatemala, and that's the results, and we do it for Honduras, etc. So Honduras have the huge part of income at risk. That is very surprising, and also is the country that has the huge population or proportion in poverty. We have to do a simulation approach, because we want to have a quickly estimation about the what is going on, and that's what we have to do. This is all the percentage that I am talk about. This is how percentage of the households is losing income, and in their income, what is the percentage of the part of their income is lost. And then we have all these scenarios, and we choose 2 of that scenarios that is closing for the GDP macroeconomic decline. For example, Guatemala declines 4% in nominal terms. So we took these 2 extremes scenarios, and we took the estimation about these 2 extremes, what we call concentrated losses and dispersed losses, to the estimation. This is the social protection networks that the governments implement. They use the subsidies schemes that are before the crisis. In El Salvador, for example, we have the liquefied petroleum gas to cook. We use it, and then the government has a subsidized that consume. Also, they share what we call canasta alimentaria, is a food basket for every household in the country, and that was part of the program. Guatemala has a direct transfer, etc., etc. What we do is, this is some Simki graphs that we can illustrate what's going on. The first is the shock. We need to build a baseline with what is the situation before and what is the situation after with the shock. And this is the flows of the population of those structures of the society, and how, when explained, over the 46% of the population in El Salvador is living in a vulnerable level. That means that a shock will be going to poverty with the shock. So with the shock, we impute the programs, and like this could be you can have a household that is going down, and the safety nets maybe is going up that household, and then we have the net impact. We need to understand, or we need to approach the net impact of the two changes. And what we have seen is in the three countries, the shock was greater than the safety nets can support the household. So the poverty is in a higher level, even with the safety net programs in the three countries. That's the situation for us right now. This is Guatemala. The impact of the confinement or the quarantine was a little than El Salvador. The increase in poverty was less, but is an impact too. This is Honduras, and you can see the more high level in extreme poverty, that 45% is in poverty in Honduras, living in poverty in Honduras. This is only the impact. This is the resume. This is, you can see the changes of that percentage in the two extreme scenarios that we choose, and you can see how El Salvador is going to increase the poverty using a 5.5 poverty line, between 12 and 10%. Honduras between 3.4 and 4, and the safety net programs mitigate that impact, but the mitigation is less than the impact. In El Salvador, you have an impact of 2.8 to mitigate a 12% of increase, right? And so the level is in this chart is more clear for the two poverty lines, and right now the level is higher than before the crisis. So we have a population that we can see a new poors, and these people, for example, if you take the three countries, we have 1,030,000 new poors, and over these people, around the half was new poor in El Salvador. And taking El Salvador like example, we have the same poverty level that we have in the 2013 in the extreme case, or the 2015 in the moderate level of poverty. That's a very huge impact. Other thing that was what is the percentage of the resources that the government spend going to the poor? And we have seen that Honduras has more focus in the poor because the 5% of those resources was going to the poor, but in El Salvador, who use more quantity of resources, such 27% of that resources going to the poor. So we think that if we can use more specific information or quickly information with a census or poverty maps, the government could have the tools to reach the poverty more quickly in a crisis like this one. So this is the conclusions. There is a new POORs. In the 3 countries, the safety nets help to mitigate the impact, but they are insufficient to return to the pre-crisis level. And the economic situation for the poor family requires a broader response, because only with these programs, the economic situation for these people is difficult, right? So the recovery of economic growth and the productivity and the inclusiveness of the growth could be essential for the coming years. We think that strength the benefit registers to provoke an effective response is important. We have to improve and update the target systems and to can do a direct transfer more efficiently in the future. We need we think multi-year financial programs, because we have accumulated a lot of debt, and that was an important thing. And in this crisis, invest in the health system was important too. That's all. I think appreciate your attention, and we are open to questions.
Any questions for the audience? So I have a policy question regarding your simulations. As you mentioned at the end, El Salvador, for example, have a upper trend in the public debt, and the fiscal space is reducing. So in terms of the prioritize the government expanding, what will be the main focus on what items of the budget? Or because as you mentioned, here in this crisis, the health will be very important, but in the post-pandemic scenario, hypothetical post-pandemic scenario, capital expenditure should be one of the key part, and also can have an important effects on reducing the poverty and the income inequality. So according with the country you have a lot of heterogeneity. You have, for example, Guatemala, that is very conservative in terms of the fiscal accounts, but in the case of El Salvador, have a complicated situation in terms of public debt. And so what will be the lesson that we can learn from this crisis in terms of how reorganize the public expenditure to increase the fiscal space?
Thank you. Well, I think that one of the question was the quality of the programs to attend to the poor, because these programs need an update of their information. Because, for example, Comunidades Solidarias Rurales, that is one of that program that has conditional cash transfers use a poverty map that was built in 2000 en 2005. So is old right now. That is part. Other part is what you say, that the capital expenditure could be very important to increase. And for that, in my point of view, we have to take an account that, for example, la factura de los trabajadores públicos alcanzan 9% o 10% of the GDP. And one is the highest of the Latin American countries. And in that part, for us, introduce some rigideces to the expenditure structure. And then if you have to attend that salary, you can have more, you don't have more space for the capital expenditure and the interests. And to do that, is important get assessed for a low interest credits, and in that part we are not going in the right direction, because the MB is going higher, because the risk is accumulated right now, and that is not a good news. And we can share more things, but for the time.
Thank you, Jose. Any other question?
I had one. Thank you for the presentation, Jose. My question is whether you can differentiate between the effect of poverty in rural and urban areas, and if that could lead also to some policy recommendations on targeting the help.
Yes, very, very interesting question. In the paper, we do the differentiations for the rural and urban areas, and that this crisis of the COVID-19 was higher in the urban areas, because the new poor also are living in these urban areas, because for example, agriculture was not restricted their activities, and you have the space, right? You can go on, and then, but in the cities, you have to be in your home, and you can work, and was a very huge impact.
Thank you very much, Jose, for interesting presentation. So I will move on to the last presentation. I'll share my screen. Can you see?
Okay.
Yeah, okay, thank you. So thank you very much for the invitation to the fiscal policy panel. So the paper I will present today is entitled The New Fiscal Normal, Vaccination, Debt and Fiscal Adjustment in Emerging Economies. And the main motivation, as most of the paper in this session, was the COVID crisis. So during the COVID crisis, a lot of new things that appears in the landscape of fiscal policy, and in particular, a lot of resources were mobilized. The country mobilized a lot of resources to tackle the pandemic, but at the same time, because the nature of the shock, the mixed nature of supply and demand shock, that affected also fiscal revenue, the tax revenue. The supply chain was affected a lot, and that's affected not only direct tax revenues, but also indirect tax revenues. So in these all discussions, there is a question that remains and is related, okay, the countries are also involved in a vaccination process, and of course that contributes a lot reduce the impact of the COVID crisis, but also we will have a potential impact on fiscal account, and that's this paper is about. So what we plan to do in this paper is quantify what will be the potential impact of vaccination programs in a region in which the COVID crisis affect very hard and have very important implications in terms of the fiscal adjustment. So what we will present in particular, we are presenting a macro-fiscal scenarios in which what we have is a scenario with vaccination, other scenario in which we will have the inertial scenario of the pandemic, plus a policy response in terms of tax reform, possible tax reform. We can see some countries in the region that plan to do, others did. And at the end, we combine these two scenarios. So it's like a more simulation type of exercise. So as most of you say before, the COVID shock has a profound impact, but this is the highest impact of the whole history in Latin America. The contraction in GDP on average was 6.3, even with respect to the lack debt crisis that was around 2.4, or even the financial crisis 0.6. And what we see, the amount of resources that mobilize the countries was a positive correlated with the credit ratings. So better the financial position that have the countries, more the additional expenditure were announced to tackle the pandemic. But the result at the end was not what we would expect. At the end, what we observe is a huge fiscal and primary government deficit, and also, of course, the public debt start to grow out on average in the region very quickly. So even when we compare with the reaction with several crises. So what we did in this paper, we followed the standard model of CER model, Higginbound 2020, and we built in this model three things. First of all, we add with fiscal variable because we want to answer the policy question about the impact of the pandemic. So what we needed, because we want in some sense not put a shocks in the model to recreate the pandemic, but also have an endogenous channel transmission of the pandemic. So we add government expenditure that were allocated for a specific type of agent, if it's infected, susceptible, or recovery. We also add vaccination in the model that is new, and reinfection that is more important for the new waves that we observe in the data. The question that arrives, okay, what will be the impact on the fiscal variable with these new ingredients? But we need more. So what we need here is we need to increase the revenues. So in which amount? So we will present some scenarios of the potential tax reform and how will affect the debt dynamics. So the model is quite standard Higginbound model. So here this gamma S, gamma R represents the population that is infected, and the infection is coming through the interaction of consumption, the susceptible population when interact with the infected population, and also by labor. So they are infected either consumption or labor, or a random variable that can be in a result, or can be end up with well, a person is infected. So the second law of motion added the fact that some recoveries also can be reinfected through the same, is analogous to the previous one, consumption of labor. So the law of motion that describes all the epidemiological framework is we have 4 types of agents, like or 4 stages at the end: susceptible, infected, recovered, or disease. So the susceptible of the next period is the net of the susceptible of this period, net of the new infected, that is given by this gamma S. And we net of this population, net of this theta B is the rate of vaccination, that here in the model is a exogenous. The infected population, so it's a share of the previous population infected, net of the disease and the recovery population, plus the new infected population and plus new reinfected population. And the recovery, what we have here, the recovery of the next period will be the recovery of the previous period plus the infected population that is recovered and the population that is vaccinated. That will be account for this recovery net of the population that is reinfected. And the disease follow this very simple low motioning with the disease is the next period, the disease of this period, and a share of the population that unfortunately died and accounts for this, the accumulated number of persons that disease every period. So how will be the preference here? And this is very important part of the model. We focus on GH preference. So GH preference in terms of consumption and government expenditure, and this G is type dependent of the agent, is susceptible, infected, or recovery, and the government expenditure will be allocated directly depending on the type of agent. So this type of preference rule out the income effect. So at the end, what we end up in this type of model to have a fiscal multiplier in terms of the government expenditure that is allocated to the type of agent. And we have the budget constraint. And here the budget constraint is the typical budget constraint with fiscal policy, but depending on the measure of each type of agent. So we have susceptible, infected, and recovery. And we have a consumption tax. And here, in terms of the revenue that the agents receive revenue coming from the labor and capital. So we have tax on capital, but also we will have, because the pandemic affect the labor supply, we will have income coming from labor of susceptible, infected, of recovery. So what we have here, detail affecting both sides, is a proxy for lockdown. That's it follow the Ekenbaum approach, and we have bonds, government bonds that the households use like an asset to transfer consumption from one period to the other, and we will have also capital. And the capital moves according with this slow motion with capital adjustment costs, very standard. So the model is quite standard. We adapt with characteristics of the epidemiological framework. So what is happening in the optimal condition, and this is very important. So here we have the Euler conditions for type depending of the agent. So here the standard result of consumption, taxes, and lockdown should be affected transitional dynamics of consumption. The role of government expenditure at the end affect the intertemporal margin, depending on the complementarity of sustainability between consumption and goods. So that is very important. And the pandemic at the end is traducing in a distortion, intertemporal distortion, that is given by the infected, and how this will be persistent over time. So what we have here is that the transitional dynamics, how change from one state or to other depends a lot on what is happening with the pandemic. Similar happens with labor supply. Labor supply is affected by the standard distortion coming from taxes. Lockdowns have the similar impact on taxes, but the effects of the pandemic, we will have persistent effects on the labor supply over time. So it's not a traditional type of analysis in which the distortion is only static. Here is more dynamic. So the supply part is quite standard. We have a nominal rigidity. So here there is a single firm producing final goods that use a continuous of intermediate goods that are differentiated. And each firms in this continuum of goods have their own monopoly of each type of intermediate goods. and the price is adjusted according with Calvo pricing. So what we need this because in fact the price is not adjusted so quickly, and we have episodes in which the inflation is not, in fact, because the mix of the shock, inflation is very, there is episodes of disinflation, in fact. The policy rule is quite standard, depends, the interest rate depends on the inflation gap and output gap. And the interest rate, the external interest rate is according with the endogenously moving with the total level of public debt. So here, public expenditure, very important because the public expenditure is depending of the stage of the mass of the agent. If it's infected, susceptible, or recovered. If it's infected, there is a share of the public expenditure that is allocated for that. If it's susceptible, there is two parts of the government expenditure. One is for prevention of being infected, and the second because the expenditure in vaccines. And the recovery is quite R1 process, very exogenous here. So here we differentiate the impact of government in infected and susceptible. So the budget constraint is quite standard. So what we have for the government, revenues coming from tax collection, and we have that the government need to finance government expenditure and need to pay the interest rate that is in domestic and foreign denominated debt. And we calibrate the model for the typical Latin American economy previous the pandemic, 2019, and we compare with respect to this, like our state previous the pandemic. We calibrate the tax rate that replicate their revenues for average revenue for consumption, labor, and capital, and also the model replicates the ratio of consumption and capital output and investment output. So what are the three scenarios what we want to show you? First, inertial scenario in which there is an epidemiological shock, the pandemics, how it reacts, then combines this inertial scenario with vaccination. So what we did here is around 5% of susceptible population is vaccinated every week. This is similar level of vaccination that have Chile, for example. And a third scenario, we have this COVID shock plus a tax reform, increase the tax of consumption, labor and capital, on average that produce an increase in 2 percentage points of GDP in 2022. It's a temporary shock here. And fourth, we combine. So here, 2022, because we want that after the shock, there is a recovery. And so we expect that it stay on track on 2022 or 2023. So what are the results, the main results that have the simulation on each scenario? Here, this is 2019, and the green line is the inertial scenario where we observe is a huge contraction, replicate the contraction that we observed 2020. And the convergence in the medium term without doing nothing start to take time around 23, 24. With vaccination, that is the dotted blue line, the consolidation process starts to be more quickly, and even in the 2022, we can observe a small primary surplus. This is the primary balance. But the most effective scenario is vaccination with the combination between vaccination and tax reform. That turns out in a situation in which we start to exhibit primary balance similar to what we have previous the financial crisis. So what implies in terms of fiscal balance that we expect with the combination of scenarios and the pandemic is start to converge at the level of between 1 or 2% of GDP. Before the pandemic, the fiscal deficit was around 3% of GDP. So it's an important correction in the medium term. So what are the implications in terms of debt? So in terms of debt, the situation is completely different. And in some papers, the presenters argue in the second paper, Roberto Barrio, this situation is in terms of debt is very complicated, and even more complicated, and it's very difficult to compare to the pre-pandemic period, and that's right, because here in the inertial scenario, even if the public finance return to the pandemic periods, it's very complicated that we end up with the same level of public debt that we have in 2019. So even with vaccination and with a very good speed, I take into account reinfections. So it's very complicated that the dynamics of public debt start to decrease over time. So in the scenarios where we have the combination of vaccination and tax reform, that change the dynamics, but even in that case, the reduction over time is very painful. It takes a lot of years, and even we expect that more than 2013 that start to be reducing at the level of 57. So the leveraging public debt in the region will take a lot of time. And why we are concerned about this? Because episodes of debt overhang. We don't want to have a situation in which this public debt start to be problematic for the economic growth prospectus in the medium term. So these are the decompositions. So what we have here, the inertial scenario in which we have without vaccination and tax reform. So we hear the economic growth for the 2020 accounts a lot for the increase in public debt, and onwards, the interest, the payments is a huge budget inflexibility that create that this public debt start to increase across time. So what is happening when we have vaccination scenario? Vaccination helps in terms of growth, not much in terms of interest payments, and not much in terms of the fiscal adjustment that the country needs. So when we combine in a tax reform, what we expect is that the effect to reduce public debt is a combination between growth and fiscal effort, and is amplified with vaccination. So let me conclude. This is the impact in the very short run. This is not long-term impacts on growth. This is more in the transitional dynamics that produce the model. So that show these important effects, additional value with respect to the baseline scenario in terms of growing percentage point. So let me conclude. So what we want to have here is answering a policy question. So what we need to restore fiscal consolidation in the future, the answer is on average 2 percentage point on increasing on revenues in this case. We don't consider the case of adjustment in government expenditure side. This is our other part of the analysis that we want to tackle, and this is very important because here we want to highlight the fact of you need more government expenditure to tackle the pandemic, but the question that remains is, okay, how we can start to support all the measures for the pandemic, create fiscal space, but at the end, we want that this expenditure not become permanent. Of course, what we need is in the medium term, start to increase to restore the tax base, and increase the fiscal revenues. One positive side, but it's very temporary and with a high cost of volatility, is that for the country that is very oriented on commodity, so that we will expect for the next year around one point of GDP of additional fiscal revenues, but this is not a permanent source for finance this shock. So this is the question that remains, and I say before, it's more a policy paper, and I open to the discussion and questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Oscar. That's a very interesting paper, and I like very much the topic that you chose. I would like to hear other people's questions, but my own is actually about whether you could calibrate your model to perhaps some two polar cases in Latin America. I mean, the case of Peru, for example, really strikes me because I was not expecting the country to suffer as much as it did. On the other hand, I'm starting to get used to Brazil's results. To some extent, vaccination is actually moving much faster than I expected. So I wonder whether within this class within this region, right, you could perhaps pick not necessarily these two, but some two polar cases where you think that some of the parameterization is slightly different, and therefore the results and policy implications would be perhaps different in both cases, right? So I think that's my first question. The second question, it's not really a question, it's a comment. It's about the fiscal revenues. What I have been seeing is that vaccination in other countries can also help Latin America. So for instance, this year, some of the Latin American countries have higher fiscal revenues because they have seen an improvement in terms of trade, which perhaps was driven by vaccination in the more advanced economies, and perhaps China's better control of the pandemic. So there are externalities here that could affect your model, and which may not depend on the Latin American countries' vaccination per se, but also on the vaccination in other places. So these are my only two comments. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much. Very wonderful comment. For the first point, yes, I agree, and it's very interesting. For example, the case of Mexico. Mexico, the additional expenditure was about 2.5 of GDP. I say in average, in additional expenditure in Latin America was 4% of GDP. So Mexico will be a very important polar case. The other can be, for example, Peru or Brazil. In fact, Brazil allocated a lot of resources. But the point, one crucial point here is informality. How the size of informality matters a lot, and what we see that the informality even reduced because the inactive people increased. But that's very, very, very interesting. We can do that. And the other point is crucial, and we didn't see this part of the vaccination of other countries acts like externality. We are worth thinking about the turn of trade, the shock on oil prices, but of course have a heterogeneous effects. So we will check it out. This
and here, Oscar, I would go beyond energy prices. I mean, I think energy prices became, to me at least, in my radar, they became more noticeable from July or August to now. But early this year, in the first or second quarters, metals gained a lot of power. Prices of metals and other types of commodities, I mean, non-energy commodities, also increased a lot. And I have seen revenues in Brazil booming. I think Chile as well. So it varies. It's not only energy, but other types of commodities as well, which implies that vaccination has some kind of universal touch. It affects everyone everywhere.
Yeah, that's right. Soy, for example, increase very. That's a very good point.
Indeed.
Thank you very much.
Well, I also see the paper very interesting, and what I want to have a question is about how do you see the debt level? The debt level, because it's not the same have 50%, 60% of the GDP than 90% of the GDP. Only the debt level ratio has an impact because you have to pay more interest interests, and so that one want to know how do you to see the debt level.
Yeah, that is very connected with the paper of Roberto in the sense that the important part here is the interest payments. Yeah, so as long as the interest payments start to growing very quickly, so it's more complicated to rise primary surplus. So that's the part, and the interest payment is in our simulation is very difficult that in the medium term reduced. So debt levels is a part that is complicated in the current situation of Latin America for at least two reasons. One is can be dragging economic growth. So we have some estimation that after 65% of GDP, the debt can have important effects on reducing in the margin economic growth, a situation of the overhang. So imagine the case that you have 72. So that will be very complicated. The second point is that most of the country, half of the country of the region have fiscal rules, and most of the countries suspend the fiscal rule. So even with fiscal rule, the behavior of the debt was increasing. But without fiscal rule, I can imagine that will be worse in the pandemic and post-pandemic episode. So here we have a huge challenge to rethinking the role of fiscal rules. So we need or not, this is a huge discussion of that. But more important, and this is more my personal opinion, we need to think in depth like an anchor, medium-term anchor, and use this fiscal rule to go to this anchor. Yeah. So, and that is will be a combination, but of course we will need to have more revenues, and we need to increase the quality and how we allocate our government expenditure to be more effective.
I had a last quick question, maybe, Oscar, about the last scenario that you mentioned, the tax reform. I know that you said that it's hard to come back to the levels, the debt levels at least that we had pre-pandemic, but the tax reform enters to the model with the aim of coming back to the path adjusted for debt, or it tries to go to a path which is better, where we can have primary surpluses for several periods, for instance.
Yeah, so the way, there are two sides of this experiment because are distortionary taxes. So you have an implication on consumption, labor, and capital, of also on growth, negative impact because distort. So you have in a recovery that will be very weak, no so profound, because before the pandemic, the productivity level was almost zero or negative. So there is no clear source of economic growth in the medium term. So the rate of the scenario that we simulate was a temporary tax reform, but of course increase the revenues in a way that will be feasible to do it. Okay, no, because if we want to back to the pre-pandemic period, should be very costly and not 1 year tax reform, but also a sequence of tax reform. So that the cost of this, I guess in that, but it should be very high. So here was a simple exercise in which increased in 2 percentage points that is feasible for the region, would be a good deal. I put the example of the last past reform in Colombia, for increase 1.5%, the plan is increase 1.5% of GDP additional revenues. So it's feasible and have positive impact on reducing that. But my personal opinion is I don't think that we're back to the levels of the 2019, but more important is that we need to back to the a sustainable path. So we need to start to increase primary surplus more in most persistent way, because we have a lot of, we have from the financial crisis until now, the most common episode is primary deficit. So we need to back to the history before the financial crisis when we have a primary surplus. And that's the challenge that we face in the medium term. Thank you. Okay, so I think that we stop here. Thank you very much for all the researchers, wonderful paper. Pick our minds and open for a lot of questions and possible research in the future. So thank you very much for all of you and all the attendance to this session.
Thank you very much. And if you have questions or want to be in touch, just send me an email. I think my information is at the LACEA website.
Me the same. Thank you very much.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.